Welcome to week 4. This is our final week. The title that I have on this week is Can Get Weird. So many of these things that I'm talking about in this week are experiences that we have or that exist in our world that make this process of becoming safer during sex weird. Not all of it falls into the category, but that's my working title for this week. Can get weird. I hope that you were able to pick at least 3 of those tools from last week and that you were able to try them out, to play with them, to implement some of this stuff so you can start to get some feedback from your own body and from your own experience about what works for you and what doesn't. An experiential tool that I'd like to share with you that I use a lot in my private practice that you can use alone or eventually together with a partner is called the 4D wheel. And it's basically a way to figure out what you're feeling, to help you when it feels like you can't make sense of what's going on and there are so many aspects and so many layers and it just feels like this big thing, this big lump of something that you can't quite figure out. A 4D wheel is really good at helping with that. So at the top of the wheel is your spiritual dimension, then your mental, physical, and finally emotional. And in the center there is going to be ecstasy and also despair. Gina Ogden works with the 4D wheel and sexual intimacy, and she calls the center the oh God. So it's like the pinnacle of sexual pleasure, oh God, and also the complete reverse, oh God. This ecstasy and despair, the extremes. So if you feel that way, or when you feel that way, know that you're in the center of this wheel. You're in the center of all of these dimensions of your human experience. So the way that you can use the wheel as a tool is to actually tease out and categorize what you're experiencing into these different categories. So at the top of the wheel in the spiritual is the I am. The mental is the I think. The physical is the I experience, and the emotional is the I feel. And so what you can do is actually describe your experience of desire and intimacy in each of these dimensions. So you can imagine yourself speaking from each of these parts of who you are, and write them down. What is it that you're feeling or experiencing as yourself, as a spiritual being during sex? What is it that you think about? What is it that you physically feel? What is it that you emotionally feel? And you actually write them down. And to get more even out of this tool is to make a big circle on the floor and actually step into each quadrant and literally put yourself into that space of who you are, and then interpret or break down your sexual experience from that aspect of self. The first time you go through the wheel, it will be your present experience, what is normally happening in your present life. And then the second time will be the past. So what did you used to feel? What did you used to experience? What sensations did you used to have? And then the third time will be what you would like it to be in the future. So imagining this healed self with loads of ability to connect and stay safe all throughout intimacy. What can you imagine that you might experience in these particular categories in an ideal future? As an attachment this week, this is her book, Gina Ogden, and she gives permission to use the worksheets in it. So I'll be giving you this one, which is basically just the wheel, and then another one for action steps. So the third time you use this wheel and you go around thinking about how it is that you would like it to be, eventually come to a place where you can experience sex in this way. You can then use this worksheet. I don't know if this is backwards or not, but For each section, it's I need to expand and then action steps. So what it is as you compare your present experience to your future experience. What is it in each of these sections that needs to change? And then making a list of how you might go about creating those changes. So the 4D wheel really allows you to see, if you're standing in it, it allows you to really feel these differences. And if you're just writing it, it's allowing you to see what the issues are and begin to truly, in an embodied sense, conceive of your sexuality as multi-dimensional. And as you're doing this, you will make discoveries and you will have insights because of the way that this is structured and organized. Now that you have a lot more information and a lot more awareness around safety as related to the experience of sex and orgasm, you can now begin to think about your other experiences of sex and orgasm. So for example, if you are a person who struggles with pleasure in sex, but you have a really high success rate of orgasm during masturbation or with previous partners or different partners, you can begin to see and understand why. So when you're masturbating, you are in control. You have complete control of the creation of the environment that you're in, right? And you probably have little things that you do, positions that you get in, things that you do with your clothing or with blankets or with where you are in the bed or how the windows are drawn or whatever, time of day, what music is playing. Like, you have complete control over crafting your experience in this. And there is the complete removal of having to negotiate with anyone else's nervous system. Likewise, with previous partners, if you're currently in a relationship and it's not the best, but you didn't have any struggles like this in the past, it's because, or most likely because, the safety cues are different now, from the body up and from the top down. So the narrative around your current experience with sexuality with your current partner is going to have some major differences versus the narrative that you had in previous partnerships. Maybe you felt safer then. Maybe you two were in more resonance then. Maybe that was before you had birth, you gave birth, and your experience of being in your body was different. Maybe there was a whole lot less pressure, and the thing that you would tell yourself was different than the things that you tell yourself now. So it's probably quite helpful for you to begin to reassess and shift. Maybe you have been caught in a place of laying blame on your current relationship or on your current partner. But now, with all of this information about polyvagal theory, you can see that there are many other circumstances. And just because things aren't working now, it does not mean that the relationship is doomed or that you're not supposed to be in this relationship just because the sex is not where you want it to be or where it used to be with other people. That said, if you are in a relationship right now and things are not going well, or your sex life is not where you want it to be, and you are in a space where you are feeling the pull to assess whether the relationship is good or bad, to assess whether you should stay or leave, which is so many of my clients, is like everybody. Then there are a few things that I recommend doing. The first is to try to see or wonder if, open yourself up to the possibility that the current struggle that you have in your relationship has been perfectly designed to require your next stage of growth. And that does not mean, oh, then I'm supposed to stay together. Not at all. The next stage of your personal growth might be leaving, might be standing up for yourself, might be creating boundaries, right? It's not that this exercise leans one way or the other, but it is really empowering, I think, and a really exciting take on this. Because what happens so often in relationships is that we think either we're meant to be together or we're not. And we're looking for signs, right? Oh, are we soulmates? Are we meant to be together? And I was 20 when I made the decision to be with this person or whatever. Or I was really sad then, and it was just out of desperation that I committed. And you start to rethink the origins of the relationship, and were you healthy enough to have made this decision to commit in the first place? But if you can wonder and get curious about this particular struggle that's facing you now, we can't connect. He or she doesn't do this thing that they used to do. The sex is not what I want it to be. Whatever it is. Financial things, health things, infidelity, whatever it is. Can you look at it from the perspective that this particular thing is inviting you toward bringing more of who you are into the world, inviting you toward a more truthful and authentic existence? And answers lie in that space. Comfort, empowerment, those lie in that space of getting curious about, wow, this has been orchestrated, or I did create this thing, or wow, this trajectory of our relationship has allowed me to do X, Y, and Z. So that you can shift out of looking at problems as reasons to leave and instead looking at them as reasons to grow. And growing might mean leaving, but I think it just puts you in a bit of a healthier place. So that's number one. Number two is working on those relational neural pathways from the bonus footage from week 2. Once you begin, especially, remember how we talked about it's like the 5 people that you spend the most time with, excluding children. And in that video, I talked about just focusing on the partnership, but in the email, I talked about also expanding it to these other people. So when you go through this mental assessment, or you can write it down, of that scale, right? When you ask those statements, I feel safe with this person, I have fun with this person, whatever those relational neural pathway statements are, and you start to see a pattern of yours, right? So it's not just with your partner, it's not just with whomever that you have these particular struggles, but you notice that you have trouble feeling safe and relaxed across all 5 of these relationships, or you see some kind of pattern emerging. That's great news, because that's what you can focus on and work on to improve. So it is very beneficial to first see where you are lacking in your abilities for whatever reason, right? There are a million reasons for that. And to work on improving those pathways first. And that might improve all of your troubles in this relationship. That might make a huge difference once you step into taking responsibility for where your lack is, where your wounds are, right? And creating these, using those somatic tools and other tips and things from that week to strengthen these pathways so that you are arriving and showing up in this relationship in the best way that you can. Creativity and sexuality are very closely linked. In fact, it works both ways. So an increase in your creative expression and your emphasis or energy that you're putting into your own creativity will be reflected in your sexuality. And the energy and intention that you're putting into your sexuality will increase your creative output. So there have been studies that have been done that have linked these two as far as sexual satisfaction and number of sexual partners being increased in creative disciplines, and that sexual dysfunction can be mitigated and overcome to some extent by creative pursuits. And they are very closely linked in spiritual traditions, as through the sacral chakra, this pelvis seat of creativity and of emotionality, of relationship, pleasure, and sexuality, this meeting of the physical and the spiritual. And that meeting of the physical and the spiritual happens when you are being creative, right? And it also happens through sexuality. Throughout time, there are all of these anecdotal accounts from women talking about that particular relationship between sex and creativity and how they can't really have one without the other. I mean, after all, reproduction really is the ultimate creative act when we're boiling it down, right? So think about that. Use that as a tool. Lean into your creativity with more intention and with more desire, with more passion, and let that spill over into your drive and your passion for your sexual expression as well. Women who are bathed in these post-orgasmic chemicals become more embodied, become happier, become more focused. These testosterone levels may indicate that we become tougher and harder to push around, harder to silence. And so it is no coincidence that women's sexuality has been so strangled and choked. Carol Gilligan writes a lot about the relationship between pleasure and the patriarchy. She's written a book called The Birth of Pleasure, which is an excellent book. So she says that the narrative of patriarchy is that love ends in pain, and that message is reflected back to us and it lives in our collective psyche. And that pleasure, the embracing of pleasure specifically by women, is what will undo the patriarchy, is what will stop it. Pleasure is a way that women stay in touch with their truth and lead the world into a new paradigm. Patriarchy seeks to dissociate women from their truth and their pleasure, making us not know what we know. But we can end that by embracing pleasure as a way out of restriction, as a way into this fullness of who we are, this embodied experience of powerful human beings. As you are in the process of rewiring your system toward safe relationship, toward connection, toward pleasure, I advise you to stay away from porn. Now, it definitely depends on what kind of porn you're looking at, of course, but there's a big risk. So what we want is for you to stay in mirroring and empathy, like from the bonus footage from the neural pathway video. We want to reduce your exposure to violent imagery. We want to reduce your exposure to things that have to make you turn off your empathy system, especially when, in this case, it's linked to sex and visual imagery of sex. So we want you to, in your exposure to sexuality, we want you to stay plugged in, stay in mirroring. We also want you to stay sensitive to low intensity arousal. So most porn is really intense. And that is going to begin to wire you towards arousal for intensity. And in these small biological cues and these small somatic tools between the two of you, we want you to stay sensitive to this low intensity arousal. And we want you to stay linking safe connection to pleasure. to reinforce that pleasure and your own arousal is linked to safe connection. And if you're watching the typical mainstream porn, then that is not necessarily going to be reflected back to you. If you were raised in a particularly religious context, that can make sex weird. So absolutely, if you were raised to, of course, restrict your sexual expression or to have shame around your body and desire, that's going to play a big role in how safe you can feel now. But what I want to introduce to you is that the kinds of ways that we experience and express romance are very overlapping with the kinds of things that we do in a religious context. Candles, incense, flowers, wine and special foods, music, dancing, words of comfort and love, touching or laying on of hands, and shouts of joy, depending on what religion it is. If your current or past religious experience overlaps with your romantic experience, then romance can become a trigger for you to withdraw, right? Or for you to go up in the spiritual context instead of down into the body. So if that applies to you, then it can be really good to think of this list of things as tools to create a consciousness shift, instead of as tools that are for church, tools that are designed by God to connect with God. Instead, you can think of them as human tools that shift consciousness, that bring you into a different state, that set apart that time, either for worship or for sex. There is a very strong connection between the diaphragm and the limbic system. The amygdala is that fire alarm that triggers the fight-flight response. That's part of the limbic system. And of course, we have breathing responses when we are coming down our ladder. It's rapid breathing when we're in fight-flight. It's very shallow breathing when we're in freeze. The diaphragm is actually part of the recuperation, the completion of the stress cycle, because it's involved in releasing the emotion through screaming or through crying or through that breath, that breath at the end of the cry, or the support of the breath to tell the story of what happened to you. So if the diaphragm doesn't get a chance to do that, to be part of this recuperation process, and we stay in danger, which is what happens in life, right? We aren't rabbits in the field where we can easily complete the cycle. There's always something else, so we stay in hypervigilance. Well, the diaphragm is going to remain constricted, and it's going to continue to affect your breathing. And, we talked about in week 1 where neuroception is happening from the environment, but also from the body. So my diaphragm that's now constricted is going to communicate back to the brain, hey, things are still bad, still can't breathe. It's not good here. And that will continue to pump out this stress response. And so what the diaphragm needs, in particular, is information from the environment that this is now safe. And I tell you that because I think it's really interesting and good for you to know, but also because you can, if you resonate with this, you can look up diaphragmatic breathing, and you can look into self-abdominal massage, which is what I do with all of my clients. I don't even care why they're here, who they are, how old they are. I do it with them. So I have an inflatable therapy ball called the Gorgeous Ball, but there are many on the market. And you lie on top of it and you do a particular technique to allow for abdominal massage. And that is going to give a lot, there's benefits for every system in the body, but it's going to transmit a lot of information of safety, specifically to the diaphragm, which will calm the system entirely. So I recommend getting one of those and reading up about it, so that you can do abdominal massage all the time, at home in your regular practice. It takes just a few minutes, and it has really big impacts on your emotional life and also on your sexuality. Being stuck on the ladder often results in specifically being stuck in freeze and then working your way up to fight flight and then collapsing back down into freeze again. And that can show up as depression, rage, depression, rage, depression, rage. Because when we are stuck in freeze, it is difficult to come out. The freeze body does not want to respond to safety. The freeze body wants to keep freezing and collapsing. And it becomes very overwhelmed by life. So, if you are able to mobilize a bit out of freeze and start to come up your ladder based on environmental and body cues that now things are safer, if you are not met with a lot more safety, especially relational safety as you start to come up the ladder, you can plummet very easily back down. So, we talked about the top of the ladder, coming down, mobilizes a lot of energy, and then that energy collapses down into freeze. Well, when collapsed energy begins to be expressed, it can be weird. It can be unacceptable. It can be strong and wild and ugly, and that can drive the people in our lives away. So, if you are a person who bounces back and forth between those two expressions, that's a good indication for you that you need more safety, that you need more of this social engagement online. And once you can start to map your regular experience, you can have these windows into interventions that might work for you. But what I also want to tell you about is that depression can be a mask for rage. And it's what Ruth King calls a high control disguise for rage. Because you're attempting to control other people that you're in relationship with by needing to be rescued and being needed to be fed energy by them. So this isn't clinical depression, and it's not depression related to a particular circumstance that you've been dealt in life. But this is what she calls a lifestyle of conditioning the self to stamp out all rage. And so along with stamping out all the rage goes the light and the optimism too. And it's a state of hopeless despair. She says, depression is our way of shrinking in physical and emotional size to silence the rage we feel for existing. And it has its roots in our childhood. So we have caregivers and parents who are unresponsive, who do not provide the affection and attention that we need. And so we increase our needs, and we become really needy kids in order to get more of what we need from them. And when we see that that trick or that tactic is ineffective, then when we increase our need level and that's not met, then we have to care for ourselves. And when we realize that we have to care for ourselves no matter the level of our need, then that's reflected back to us that nothing makes a difference and we have no control. So you could be a person who is ping-ponging on this ladder, absolutely, and you could also be a person whose depression or freeze state is masking a whole lot of rage and anger. So in her book, Ruth King's book called Healing Rage, she has a whole battery of things that you can do to employ. She has lots of examples of disguises for rage, and depression is only one of them. And she goes through conversations to have with the people in your life, with the people in your past, different kinds of meditative states that you can use, journaling practices, and then reframing what has seeded the rage in your life through the eyes of the benefit of it, what it has taught you. So it just is a bit of a, it's not a bit of, it's a revolutionary practice, specifically for women to deal with their rage. So I do recommend that book. But I wanted to just make that link between the two, just so you have that in your mind and that you know that there is absolutely a relationship between those two feelings. Okay, so let's talk about trauma. What trauma does is that it marginalizes people. It isolates people. It takes us away from our ability to co-regulate. We are meant to risk, to be people, especially little people when we're children. We are meant to go out and risk and test out our ability to be in the world, test out the environment, right? The larger and larger environment, the older we get. And then we are meant to, every time, retreat and return to safety. And what trauma does is remove that. And traumatized people have nothing to retreat to. It is just more danger. Sexual trauma in particular is a powerful disruptor of our ability to connect with other people. It creates body numbness, compromises our health overall. It forces us into dissociation and disappearing. And it violates a person's concept of self. And so because of that, it often manifests in issues around purpose in life, feeling totally lost, giving up, like you're just wandering around here and you have no drive and focus and purpose. Related to that is suicide ideation. What's the point of life? Why am I even here? It's so much easier to just check out. The effect of sexual trauma is that co-regulation becomes a trigger for withdrawal. And we become really, really comfortable and safe in shutdown. That's our safe place. So immobilization with fear. And as you know, immobilization with fear is the realm of the dorsal vagal. So the dorsal part of the vagus nerve, this below the diaphragm. So sexual trauma is going to influence the dorsal vagal mediated organs, which means it will lead to sexual dysfunction. It will lead to gut problems, because those things are what the immobilization or shutdown field is responsible for. So when you have constipation and diarrhea, and the medical establishment thinks that that's an end organ problem. So you have a problem with your stomach, you have a problem with your intestine. No, it's not. What this is a response from your autonomic nervous system to keep you safe. Because voiding your bowel reduces your metabolic load. And when you are in activation or shutdown, you need to reduce your metabolic load to keep yourself alive. So this is why any kind of surgery below the diaphragm, abdominal or pelvic surgery, as well as birth, have overlapping symptomatology with sexual trauma. Because it's all about that dorsal vagus. In all of these situations, the body has been intruded on without welcome. In birth, you've got lights and people, and even if you're at home, you got hands up in there and instruments in there. And we don't have the knowledge in our culture and our society to be able to effectively communicate safety to the body before and during these procedures. The body's been intruded upon without welcome, and the body will respond as being victimized. The body will communicate danger to the brain immediately. Hey, there's a huge problem. Everything's really bad. We got to get out of here. Can't get out of here, then we've got to check out of here. So rape, birth, gallbladder surgery, whatever, they can all result in a loss of sexual feeling and desire, an increase in gut pain, a freezing of the diaphragm and pelvic floor. So what's the answer? The answer is usually therapy. And it's usually a really good somatic therapy like somatic experiencing. What we want ultimately is to bring a greater awareness of your autonomic state, to slowly bring you out of freeze. What's called a titrated co-regulation. So if co-regulation, because you are now a survivor of one of these things, including sexual trauma, if co-regulation is now a trigger for withdrawal, then my coming up to you and delivering you all of these wonderful biological cues of safety and playing hide and seek is going to make you freak out. It's going to make it worse. It's going to pull you deeper into the hole. So a titrated or a slow and measured exposure to social engagement is really where the healing happens. Porges says, bottom-up stabilization creates a top-down organization. So we've got to feel safe in the body to change the narrative in the brain, and the narrative will then help the body. We have a bidirectional nervous system. So that's what we want, is for these two things to meet in the middle. Safety in the body, safe narrative, creating more safety in the body. And then it's this feedback loop of safety and of healing. Going forward with this entire course, with all of this information, all of these videos, you can do this slowly. You can allow the education of this, just hearing me say these words, begin to rearrange your life. You can let the insights come. Let the information help you create a new narrative. Begin to put your experiences and what you know about yourself, plug them into the context of this theory so that you can make a lot of sense out of it and feel like, yeah, I can affect these things. And then as you begin to implement the tools, do it slowly. This does not have to be all at once. In fact, it's better if it is not. Take your time. Let it happen naturally. Let there be, don't allow your system to be overwhelmed by the changes you're making. Take it as it comes. And if this is too much, if you are a victim of trauma, a survivor of trauma, if you are overwhelmed by this information, if it is too much to think about implementing these tools, if you have pain during sex, if you have pelvic floor issues, if you have a prolapse, if you pee when you sneeze or cough, get help. We live in a time when there is so much help available to us. A wide variety of practitioners, of people who are passionate about these kinds of subjects and about helping women with these things. From the crunchy to the super allopathic, you can find someone who resonates with you. So if you have tried therapy and you hated it, try it again. So recognize where the overwhelm is, recognize where you need help, and then seek that help. And if you want me to try and assist you in finding somebody, reach out and ask. I don't know people all over the world, but I can try. And you can tell me your specific situation, and then I can recommend the right kind of practitioner based on my knowledge and experience. I'm happy to do that for you. Thank you for joining me for this course. I feel very privileged to be able to reach you in this kind of personal way. And I feel really touched by the reception that I've gotten so far with this material. And I wish for you a lot of pleasure. I wish for you the healing that you desire, and the intuitive capacity to find the right path toward that healing. And I will remain holding space for your pleasure, the pleasure of play and of connection, of safety, and of orgasm. I hope to see you in the future. Thanks again.